Hello, hello. I'm Snowie the Snowfox. The following story contains excessive scenes that some viewers may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. This is a cautionary tale, and unlike most of the other reviews on this product, this is a true story, and its authenticity can be qualified by a small news item that appeared in the Toronto Star's local news section during the month of April in 2013. I would consider myself a prudent man, not given to bouts of outspokenness or craving attention, and certainly not one to rock the boat. On any given day, I can be found reading a crime novel on a park bench in the middle of the city, soaking in the opulence of nature while nibbling on a fresh tuna sandwich and fending off the voracious gulls and squirrels that threaten to spoil my repose. This is me, law-abiding and introspective, which is why it came as a shock to me to find myself incarcerated because of the devil's confectionery, Satan's sweetmeat, Lucifer's lozenges, the horror that is known as Haribo sugar-free gummy bears. I'll set the scene. It was late winter, early spring in Toronto, and the city had just been digging itself out from a late-season snowstorm. I was heading to Pearson International Airport for a red-eye flight to Amsterdam in order to give the Dutch arm of our company some training on new software that had been installed. I'm deliberately being vague to prevent my place of work from being linked in any way to the incident that occurred. I had just finished packing, checking the time, and found that I was running late. My flight was at 7:10, and it was now almost 5 p.m. Cursing softly, I ran out to the car and threw my bags into the trunk, hitting the gas a little harder than usual in my haste to make it to the long-term parking lot as soon as possible. Luckily, traffic was light on the 401, and I made it to the airport in record time, but I knew that my chances of making the flight were still at risk if I didn't use my time wisely. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and I was feeling a bit hungry, my stomach rumbling loudly in protestation, which caused me to look around at the other travellers rushing past me in the busy terminal, mortified that my bodily noises might be heard by others. I briskly checked my watch and decided that I had enough time to grab a quick snack before going through the baggage check and security, and would get something more substantial once I checked in through security. I spotted a vending machine nestled in a relatively low-traffic corner of the terminal and rushed over, already pulling out my credit card and mentally assessing what I had a craving for so as to save time interacting with the machine. My eyes scanned the colourful array of confectionery quickly, coming to rest on a tantalising, rainbow-coloured bag of gummy bears, with the simple white and red logo, Haribo, emblazoned across the bag in what appeared to be a slightly tweaked Helvetica rounded font. Now, I'd pause here in the story for a moment to underscore the importance of making proper choices. I was hungry. When you're hungry, you should eat food. Food is defined as a nutritious substance that people consume to maintain life. This is what food is. These days, the definition of the word food has been bastardized, and the meaning has been broadened to include veritably any material that can be digested, or rather, chewed and swallowed without causing harm or severe illness. Haribo sugar-free gummy bears are not food. They aren't even from this planet. I imagine their origins being conceived in a boardroom in hell by a top team of creative pain administrators, with senior-level demons rubbing their hands together in ghoulish delight as hell's chief chemist slowly lifts the veil on their new creation. The point being here, I made a very, very, very poor choice. I pushed the button and the vending machine ejected the brightly coloured bag into my awaiting hands. I'd always liked gummy bears. They were bright but rather innocuous. They weren't overly sweet so as to become cloying, and of course each candy came in the visage of a rather happy, docile bear, reminiscent of the picture one's mind's eye holds of all anthropomorphic bears, from Yogi to Winnie. The way I figured it, I was taking a bit of a holiday from life so I could relax my fastidiously regimented daily schedule a little to allow for some frivolity. After all, I was going to be in Amsterdam come morning, with 16 hours to kill before I had to be training the Dutch employees. Maybe I would take a trip down to one of the coffee shops in the red light district and really let my hair down. No, I wouldn't do that. I would see the area of the city from the bus as I went to the hotel, where I would eat at the hotel restaurant and drink some sparkling water. So I'd better enjoy the gummy bears, my one extravagance to commemorate my break from routine. I joined the queue in the KLM line, which was mercifully short, most likely because all the passengers for my flight had already been checked through, as the flight was scheduled to depart in an hour. I checked my watch again, frowned, and absent-mindedly opened the bag of Haribo sugar-free gummy bears and began to munch on them as the line slowly advanced. To be fair, they tasted fine, and just like every other manufacturer's brand of colourful candy, they were sugar-free to boot. If they had tasted off or different, I most likely wouldn't have continued to shovel them into my mouth absent-mindedly while daydreaming about what I would order to eat from room service in my hotel in Amsterdam. As I gave the attendant my e-tickets and she weighed my bags, the first pains began in my stomach. I thought nothing of it at first, chalking it up to the fact that I needed something more substantial than gummy bears to tackle my hunger, but over the course of the next 5 minutes the shooting pain began to come in more rapid succession. At this point I had my boarding pass printed and rubbed my stomach a little. I proceeded to security. I briefly entertained the thought of trying to find a restroom before going through security, but at that point my discomfort was manageable and I didn't think it was going to get any worse, certainly not within the amount of time it would take to clear security. I joined the line and started fishing for my passport to present to the agent checking for tickets. I felt a thin sheen of sweat break out on my forehead and underarms, and my features flushed for a moment as a wave of heat washed over me. I didn't pay much heed, as going through security always caused me great anxiety, and I chalked it up to pre-flight jitters. It was only as I stood face to face with the agent and handed her my passport and ticket that I had a glimpse of the agony that was about to begin. It felt like time rippled for a moment, as if my consciousness buckled, so intense was the pain that fired through my bowels. I grimaced and emitted a low moan and felt myself take an involuntary step sideways. Stars shot through my head briefly, and my vision blurred and then snapped back into focus. The agent was staring at me with slight consternation and asked me if I was all right. I pulled myself together and stood up straight and declared that I was fine, mortified that I had a lapse of decorum not only in public but at the security clearance in an airport. As I fumbled off my belt to go through the metal detector, the pain in my stomach increased, and I practically had to sit on the floor to take my shoes off, terrified of what would happen if I bent at the middle to do it. It was becoming increasingly more evident to me that this wasn't just a stomachache. No, this was something much worse. As a child, I had a bout of diarrhea after a trip to Mexico with my family. I remember the feeling of nausea that swept through me before my child self had surrendered to the gas pains and parked myself on the toilet for hours, shitting until I felt like I didn't have any bones left. And that was how I was feeling now, with several key differences. The pain was worse. The sense of an impending bowel movement was so formidable it gave me temporary amnesia, and it took all of my willpower, all of it, to clench my butt cheeks together to prevent my sphincter from exploding. A sudden shock of pain racked through my body, and I half wondered if I was going to give birth to a Tasmanian devil. The crazy, fever-inducing image of said cartoon animal chasing Bugs Bunny through the splashy volcanic shit kettle that was my stomach caused me to elicit a short, maniacal bark of laughter as I approached the metal detector, a wild, distant look in my eyes, sweat now beginning to pour off me like a long-distance runner in Kenya. The security agent on the other side of the detector shot a quick glance over to her co-worker, who narrowed his eyes and made a subtle movement towards his holster. My breathing became uneven as I entered the metal detector and realised with alarm that I had taken off my socks without even registering it, and one of my shirt tails was untucked from the front. I held my breath, my eyes bulging dangerously from my head as the machine scanned me. As I shakily moved forward towards the agent for a pat-down, my stomach began to elicit sounds that can only be described as otherworldly. It started off as a sort of blubbing sound, heard from afar, and grew in pitch and intensity at an alarming rate. My jaw dropped in shock as what I can only describe as the sound of an agonising wailing alley cat in heat, with a persistent Doppler effect added to its voice emitted from some nether region of my intestines. The officer's eyes widened in alarm as she kept her eyes glued on my stomach as she thoroughly patted me down. As she reached my shins, I felt my innards suddenly expand and plummet towards my rectum. With cat-like reflexes, I squeezed my sphincter shut with what seemed like nanoseconds to spare, and I knew that if I didn't get to the bathroom immediately, I would shit myself. With a Herculean effort and all of the strength that I could muster, I forced my butt cheeks together, knowing that one false move could open the floodgates. I began to walk like a duck, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible, not even caring now what other people were seeing in front of them, a dishevelled, barefoot 40-year-old businessman with red-faced, bulging eyes, sweating profusely, shaking slightly and walking without bending his knees. With a single-minded intensity, I grabbed my carry-on socks, shoes from out of the plastic tub that had passed the X-ray inspection, and without putting anything back on, I turned on my heels with the intention of finding the nearest restroom and slowly dying there one squirt at a time. But that's not what happened. I turned to go and found myself staring at 3 armed agents who stopped me and asked me if I would follow them. "Why, what's the matter?" I stammered, wincing slightly as the act of speech seemed to strain the tenuous and extremely fragile truce I had negotiated between my bowels and the tempest that raged within. "I just have to go to the bathroom right now," I pleaded. "Just follow us, please," they said, leaving no room for argument. The other travellers clearing security check stared with curiosity and revulsion at the spectacle unfolding before them, whispering amongst themselves and hurrying to pack up their belongings and get as far away from me as possible, no doubt assuming that the airport had nabbed some sort of domestic terrorist. If I hadn't been feverishly trying to hold back the eruptions of Mount Vesuvius, I likely would have died of shame. With each step I took towards the room that they ushered me into, I felt that my legs would give way. I marvelled at how strong the human will could be. Marvelled at what was essentially patching a hole in the Hoover Dam with bubblegum, and wondering if it could actually be sustained indefinitely. Maybe I would make it through this ordeal after all. The room they brought me into was an examination room. I had pretty much stopped registering details of my environment as my consciousness closed off all but the absolutely necessary functions: breathing, ability to walk, but I snapped back to reality when I heard the snap of rubber. The slow dawning of realisation poked through my agony and stoic resolve as I turned to face an agent donning rubber gloves. "Sir, we're going to have to perform a cavity search on you," a young, fresh-faced agent stated in a firm but emotionless voice. His short-cropped blonde hair was immaculate, and for a crazy moment I wondered if he was an actor and this was all some sort of elaborate practical joke done to amuse bored kids watching YouTube. He must have taken my tortured silence for resistance, because he looked at me sharply and said, "Lower your pants and underwear, please," and face the desk. Panic started to grip me in its icy grasp, and the sudden adrenaline threatened to destroy my sphincter bulwarks and rend my anus in two. I inhaled sharply, and with a pained gasp I doubled up my efforts to clench my butt cheeks together. "Sir, please," I begged, deferring to this kid in an act of desperation. "I have to go to the bathroom. You can follow me to the stall if you need to. I had some bad Haribo sugar-free gummy bears, and now I feel like..." But they had stopped listening and smirked at each other. 2 of the other agents, a tall, dark-haired female and a shorter, balding fat man, looked away from me, and I could see them shaking as they stifled their laughs. "Sir, face the wall, put your hands on the desk and spread your cheeks," the young agent stated, a lopsided grin on his face. "But..." I began to protest, and then a fresh shock of pain forced me to stop and lean on the table for support as an ungodly howling rose from my stomach, something between the dying moans of a woolly mammoth and the sound of bubble wrap popping underwater. I exhaled shakily, and my focus began to narrow as I rallied for the final battle. Shaking uncontrollably and sweat literally raining down on the tabletop in front of me, I turned to face the wall and heard a meek, childlike voice pleading from somewhere in the room. "Please," it said, and then again, "Please." From somewhere within me, my mind recognised that this sound had issued from me, although my consciousness had now begun to separate from my body, and I held my breath and prayed to God for strength. He probably had some heroin or something that opened up there, the female guard said, as part of me that hadn't escaped into the ether yet acknowledged that she was behind me to my left. Probably high as a kite. Look at him, she said. The shorter guard agreed with a snort off to my right. Spread your cheeks, the young agent said, his voice directly behind me, and lower than the other two. And bend over. Please. I whispered in a desperate, maniacal mantra, not even aware of my surroundings anymore. I felt like I was lost in an opium fog with half-snatched images and sounds filtering through to create nonsensical versions of reality. Another volley of pain tore through me, and I involuntarily leaned forwards over the desk. My focus completely narrowed now to a spot on the wall 2 feet in front of me, a curious imperfection in what seemed to be a whitewashed stone wall. It was a dark blotch about 5 millimeters long and shaped like a smiling bear, a yellow, dancing bear, no, a green bear, no, red. It was all the colours of the rainbow. My God, it was beautiful. It took something as simple as a slight breeze to trigger Armageddon. That's all. No trumpets, no fanfare, no fire raining down from the heavens, no dogs and cats living together in harmony, no fingers on the button, no prophet to predict it all. Nothing. As I stared at the rainbow bear smiling and dancing in front of me, my mouth agape, drooling, eyes glazed and bloodshot, face coated in a sheen of sweat, I heard the softest sound, an exhalation from the young agent behind me, and then, at the same instant, the warm air of his breath feather across my butt cheeks. For just a moment, maybe less, maybe a split second, I felt the presence of God there with me in that room as neurons began to misfire at a blinding rate, nerve endings bristled, and muscles twitched reflexively. I stood on the brink, with one foot hovering over the edge, and then, without taking a step, I found myself plummeting. With a sound like an extra-large plastic ketchup bottle being run over by a Mack truck, my sphincter released. The pressure of the blast pushed me hard into the desk, and the legs of the desk screeched as they scraped across the floor. My body remained rigid for a moment, and I experienced a relief that can only be described as orgasmic in its purity. My eyes rolled back into their sockets, and my tongue lolled out of my head like a half-sedated dog, and I emitted a low, sustained groan that grew in pitch as the filthy torrent pushed its way out of my body. Tremors racked my body, and I must have looked like a fish out of water with an endless stream of shit firing out of its ass. Other sounds and sensations started to filter in now as my consciousness began to materialise once more. The muffled scream of a dungeon filled with prisoners near death radiated from my stomach. The rushing sound of litres of liquid trying to escape through an aperture too small to accommodate it all at the same time. The omnipresent sound of chunky liquid splattering against a hard surface with great force. The high-pitched screaming of a woman's voice calling out to God, another voice sobbing uncontrollably, imploring to make it stop, and my own ecstatic, monotone wail. When my ordeal had eventually run its course, I was left panting for breath and wobbly-legged, half crying, half laughing with relief, barely lucid, and feeling as if I had birthed an elephant. My colon felt like someone had poured chili sauce all over it, and then sent it into a colony of fire ants to eat. Through my sobs, I heard the sound of dripping, like when the sprinklers are eventually turned off after an office fire, or after a thunderstorm when the willow that overhangs the pond continues to rain down long after the sky has stopped. From behind me, the sobbing continued, and I heard someone trying to speak in a walkie-talkie, but nonsensical words were all that the man could speak, which sounded like the ravings of a lunatic. With great relief, I slowly pulled myself off the table, legs trembling, my stomach eliciting one last sound, a loud, prolonged gas bubbling that eerily resembled a pig orgasm. I slowly turned my head to survey the devastation, and in that instant, if I had a pencil or some other sharp object, I probably would have gouged my eyes out in revulsion. And the smell was enough to drive a man insane. It was the stench of rotting potatoes mixed with sulphur and ammonia, cooked in a broth of chicken faeces, and left to age for 2 weeks in a yeasty stew at the bottom of a French outhouse. After a half whiff of this ghoulish brine, I immediately stopped breathing through my nose, but the taste was to remain in the back of my throat for months to come. The young agent had taken the brunt of the witch's brew, and at first I couldn't process what I was seeing. I thought somehow the young blonde kid had been spirited away and replaced by a brown golem, or an ATV rider that had spent the better part of a day driving through every muddy puddle he could find after a torrential downpour. With some degree of compartmentalisation, I came to understand that for some unfathomable reason this kid hadn't moved, or hadn't been able to move, through the entire fecal deluge. He had weathered the entire assault head-on, like some sort of hero from Greek mythology. I'd given this poor schmuck a one-man shit bukkake that would make a Brazilian pornographer retch with disgust, and he was still in the same position he must have been in from the moment of first impact. I tried to comprehend how he must be feeling, what he must be going through psychologically, but it became evident very quickly that he'd become very broken. No doubt forced so deeply within himself once the fire hose had been turned on that there was little to no hope of him ever coming back from it, certainly not without extensive psychotherapy or a lobotomy. I looked beyond his quivering catatonic crouched form to see a perfect outline of him cut out on the white wall behind, either side filled with a dripping opaque layer of alternately pulpy and runny fecal stew. I noticed two quivering masses at either extremes of the room and realised they were humanoid in form, although the wailing that was coming from these broken creatures was just blubbering and gibberish. And this was the tableau that was burnt into my mind's eye for eternity. Needless to say, I missed my flight. In fact, the next week is a blur. I have vague recollections of an army of hazmat-clad figures looming through the brown landscape of the soiled room, the slopping sounds of rubber boots squelching in puddles of fetrid detritus, uncontrollable wailing and animal-like sounds issuing from the mouths of creatures that had been traumatised beyond their capacity for being put back together, the complete loss of sensation from my waist down as I was rolled through the room on a waterproof gurney, its wheels struggling to surf on top of the shit-soaked floor. I spent a week or so in the hospital, enclosed in a well-ventilated, sealed room, with suited doctors coming in on the hour to monitor my vital signs as they tried to rehydrate my body. I'd apparently expelled every available drop of water from my body that was possible to sustain life without for a short period of time. All of my clothes were incinerated in the hospital's crematorium, and the soiled bag of Haribo sugar-free gummy bears was never recovered. This is my story. It is inconceivable to think that this kind of product can be sold legally and be misrepresented as food. I was lucky. I survived. But as for the families of the survivors, and the survivors themselves, they will forever live with the trauma of the events that took place at Pearson International Airport on that snowy day in April 2013. Thank you for listening. I've been Snowie the Snowfox, and for more like this, don't forget to check me out on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 7 PM UK time over on twitch.tv/Snowie the Snowfox. Thank you.